Okay, so here I have the stove we're using. In this case, we're using an Alaskan Junior, Kni-Co Alaskan Junior Stove. There's various pieces of nesting pipe and a damper piece here. Now there's a bit of a trick with this. There's a pin that goes through your damper. It gets installed into the pipe with the hole in it. The trick is this. There's a spring here, and you can see that notched piece of metal. What you need to do is push it past where it's seated, and then rotate it. That will allow you to take the pin out. You then put the damper piece into the piece of pipe. I actually stick the pin in a little bit so I can see where I'm aiming. Okay, so now I've got that inserted. The pin's inserted through the damper and through the holes. Keep feeding it through, and it's the same thing in reverse. I push past where I want it to go, then rotate it back, and then it'll seat. And now the damper's in place. No force required, just pushing it past and rotating. I do suggest putting the stove on a couple pieces of wood. Reason is this: if you set up the stove strictly on the snow, once the stove's on and in operation, the snow underneath it will start to melt and will your legs. So when you have a nice stable setup to begin with, if burning, especially for hours, the stove can start to tilt, which can screw things up with going through your stovepipe ring or even the connection of the pipes. So to keep, much as we did with our center pole, to keep things stable and to spread out the weight, we're going to put the stove on two pieces of split wood to help split it out. So we're using a false bottom with this stove, which is a great little device. It really saves the bottom of your stove. You don't have embers or wood directly on the stove bottom. The instructions that come with these stoves say that you ought to use sand, which works well, but where do you find sand in February? So we find that saves the bottom of the stoves and increases the efficiency of the burn. You get a much hotter fire because there's air flowing up and underneath. First piece to go in the stove is the one with the damper. Face your damper out. If you face it this way, it's going to get hot and you can't adjust it. So you want that facing on the outside of the stove. Next section. Now we may need to adjust where the legs are. As you can see, we're off a bit here. So move this over and then we'll show you what we got to do on the outside. So the stovepipe ring that comes with the tents is set up for a 3-inch stove diameter. This is a 5-inch to a 4-inch. It's set up for a 4-inch to a 3-inch. So right now that won't fit through the stovepipe ring. No problem. Easily adjustable. Just take a knife, extend your slits. You can actually extend them so that you have an airspace around them. The only problem is that if you're using the tent in the spring or fall, you can get rain coming in. So I prefer to leave them so they're fairly tight around it. There we go. All right, and then the rest we'll do outside. Last step, I would assemble all the pieces into one piece and then attach this to the part that's coming out of the tent. Under this setup, the pipe stack is significantly higher than the peak of the tent, which help to keep embers off of your tent. The other part of keeping embers off of your tent is correct stove operation, which we will run through next. So we've lit the stove. A couple tips about getting the stove going. First is to have your damper in a straight vertical position, so you're not damping airflow out of your pipe when you get it going. Once it's going, we can adjust that, but for lighting it should be straight vertical. We're using a false bottom, which really does help with airflow. And then we lucked out. We found hardwood, some good dry oak, and also some dry balsam. So we're using a mix here. We have a couple nice pieces of oak on the bottom, and then we've chopped up some kindling out of the balsam. And we're using our favorite fire starter Instaflame. Get the whole thing going. Now you see we've got the door open here. A couple tips. We've lit the fire close to the front of the door. You don't want your fire starter way at the back of the stove because it's harder for air to get to it. So if you light at the front, you can control things a little easier and there's more oxygen going to it. Door's open to start with. Once that gets going, always keep an eye and see if there's any smoke coming out the front of the stove. If it was smoking, first thing I would do when I'm lighting is close the door a bit. You don't have to close it all the way, but close it a bit. If it's still smoking, close the door all the way. Okay, and once the door is closed, you can control the airflow into the fire via this little guy here. When we're lighting it though, we want as much oxygen as possible getting into the stove. It's drawing nicely up the pipe. That's another advantage of the pyramid style tent, is that it draws really well. So that's going good. We'll give that a couple minutes and then we'll come back to it. Okay, so the fire is going pretty good now. If you can see, we've gone through our kindling and we've got a decent fire going now. At this point, I would probably damp the stove down a hair. Not much. You never want to turn it completely horizontal. See the smoke coming out when I do that? That's a bad thing. So vertical, no smoke. So if you damp it down a bit, it just kind of helps to keep the heat in the tent a little more, or in the stove a little more, I mean. So just a little bit, maybe like, you know, 1 o'clock. And the other thing I would probably do at this point is close the door, and then we don't have to think about it anymore. When the door is open, you do have to always keep an eye and make sure you don't have smoke billowing out of the stove. So at this point, I'll close the door, and then you can control how much oxygen is getting into the stove via the little guy on the front here. So we're trying to cook dinner and get some tea going, so I would keep this wide open so we get as hot a burn as possible. You do have to keep an eye out for running the stove too hot. Sometimes that's going to be too much, depending on the wood you're burning and kind of the stage of where your fire is at. That may be too much, but now it's early stages still, so we can keep that wide open, and we should be good to go.